Conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the mysterious world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning con men and women. We will reveal the detail and the intricacies of their elaborate crimes and uncover how they were dramatically brought to justice. In this show, the story of the bogus and ruthless psychic who cruelly used people's beliefs in the spiritual world. Manipulating the comfort his elderly victims drew from his self-proclaimed psychic powers, he used their trust as his vindictive and vicious weapon. Targeting the most vulnerable people in society, Paul Williams preyed upon the lonely, grieving and elderly, and used their fragile susceptibility as his tool to get his hands on their life savings.
Paul Williams would describe himself as probably one of the best psychics around.
Paul Williams was the heartless conman whose insatiable charm and catalogue of lies from beyond the grave cruelly conned the mourning, old and defenceless.
I would describe Paul Williams as your opportunistic conman.
He uses his status as a psychic in order to suck people in.
Manipulating people's belief in the psychic world, Paul Williams did the unthinkable and abused his elderly victims' trust with heartfelt messages from the spiritual realm that ultimately said one thing: give him their money.
He spotted an opportunity to manipulate really what are the most vulnerable people in our society, people who are elderly and also recently bereaved.
Paul Williams was a predatory psychic who used his powers to profit from their loneliness.
And used psychology to actually make them hand over money, write a will to his benefit, basically do whatever he wants them to do.
I think Paul Williams has got a PhD in con artistry.
In 1997, a 39-year-old Paul Williams was living in Starton in the Midlands with his wife and family. Paul was a familiar face in the Black Country area and somewhat of a local celebrity due to his self-proclaimed gift.
Paul Williams is probably better known in the Midlands as Paul Duran. That's his stage name. He's a psychic, or at least that's what he wants people to think.
He'd made quite a name for himself amongst the local community with various spiritualist medium meetings that he conducted locally. And I think he liked to think of himself as quite a well-to-do gentleman.
People came to him for his psychic powers, his ability to exorcise ghosts, his ability to read the future, his ability to contact dead relatives, loved ones, things like that.
And he was very ostentatious. He's even had a car that had his own personal number plate on, psychic. So I think everybody was a little bit in awe of him, and there was no reason for anyone to believe that he wasn't genuine.
Paul Williams was charming, suave and popular, the ultimate showman. And even the beginnings of his psychic gift had a dramatic origin.
He said that he had been involved in the battle for Port Stanley, and it's an amazingly sort of atmospheric description of his death and his almost rebirth.
What he actually said to me and a few others that were around at the time was that he was, in the Falklands War, and that there was an explosion and this shrapnel was coming towards him, but that he saw it coming in slow motion, and that there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He knew it was going to hit him and he couldn't move because of the position he was in. And then he died, apparently, and felt that he'd gone to the other side because he saw the white light and he was being drawn towards the light.
And there was his grandmother at the end of the white light. And his grandmother, who he said had psychic abilities, said, "Paul, it's not your time yet. Go back and help people."
And at that point that he felt he was, psychic, and that he was back for a reason, and perhaps to be this most amazing gifted person that was going to help all kinds of people in all different ways with his gifts.
Paul Williams was interviewed in 1999 for an unaired TV pilot called The Hauntings and Mysteries of the Black Country. In this footage, Williams talks about the extraordinary event that led to his psychic awakening.
And when I came through that accident, after a long time recovering, I started to look into the reasons of why that happened to me. And I started looking into the paranormal.
Years later, Paul Williams' story was found to be a complete work of fiction and a taster of the deception that was still to come.
Checks with the Royal Air Force and the Army revealed that they'd have no record of anyone with that name or that date of birth ever serving at the Falklands at that time.
Like everything that Paul Williams says, it was a complete load of rubbish.
Despite the far-fetched fictitious origins of Paul Williams' alleged psychic gift, his career as a psychic funded a glamorous, opulent lifestyle.
Paul Williams lived in a very nice lockkeeper's cottage on a canal in Staffordshire. To look at his house, it was extremely impressive. It's very, very picturesque. It would be quite expensive to live there.
He opened a shop next to his house on the canal side, which had crystals, tarot cards, sort of, I guess you call them sort of mystic things. People would walk past, he'd stop and chat, people would buy stuff. I think it was quite a profitable business. As well as having his little psychic shop, a local hotel in Stourbridge, the Talbot Hotel, employed him as their in-house psychic. I think it was the first hotel in the country to have a psychic reading with your bed and your breakfast. So he was a well-known personality, larger than life, very charming.
A self-publicist and staple of the local newspapers, Paul Williams even made bogus claims that the police called upon his gift to help solve crimes.
Paul Williams has claimed to have helped police investigations into serious crimes. To my knowledge, he has never assisted the police in any investigation whatsoever.
But these weren't his only lies. Williams declared himself to be a psychic to a glittering array of celebrities.
He also claimed to have been a friend or given spiritual advice to various celebrities.
We have a sort of litany, really, of sort of TV, sports, music stars, Mick Hucknall, Simply Red, Babs Windsor, Steve Davis, Michael Barrymore.
And he actually told me that he'd actually done the whole cast of Coronation Street, I believe it was, and that he'd also read for some of the EastEnders cast.
I asked him about whether he was a psychic to the stars. I said, "Oh, you were a clairvoyant Barbara Windsor, weren't you?" And he said, "Oh yes, but that was some time ago. That was a long time ago." I said, "Oh right, so it's true then, is it?" "Oh yes," he said. And I said, "Michael Barrymore, you're a friend of his?" He said, "Oh, yes, a little bit more on shaky ground." I said, "Mick Hucknall, Steve Davis?" "Yeah, some time ago," he said.
When asked, all the celebrities Williams has claimed to have given psychic readings to deny any knowledge of meeting Paul Williams or Paul Duran.
But the lies that he told weren't just connected to celebrities. They weren't just harmless, "Oh yes, I was an RAF hero." They weren't just, "Oh yeah, I was a mate of Michael Barrymore." They were much more harmful than that. He preyed on the old and vulnerable. We think, perhaps, that he cons a lot of people, but the way he did it, it's very difficult to prove. Irene Hickson is a prime example. She was an old lady. She was very into the paranormal. She was very into psychic abilities. She's very interested in all that sort of stuff. Having talked to Irene's relatives, we believe that Paul met Irene through one of these séance evenings that she'd attended. He told her, like he did to many other women, that he could speak to her husband from beyond the grave. Irene Hickson believed him. I mean, he's a charming man. He's got a very good psychic pedigree. She believed in this sort of thing. She probably wanted to believe that he could speak to her dead husband.
She was obviously extremely distressed and felt she needed some comfort and having a belief in psychic phenomenon, and believed that Paul could actually potentially contact her husband, and to know he was thinking about her obviously gave her an enormous amount of comfort. And Paul very much took advantage of that.
Paul Williams' psychic pedigree has now proven to be bogus, but in 1998 he was in the perfect position as one of the West Midlands' leading clairvoyants and psychics, and he had openly spoken about his alleged special powers.
I went up into the bedroom where she'd got the problems, and as I closed the door, every single photograph on this sideboard came off there and flung straight at me and knocked me against the wall, which shook me a little bit.
But no one knew that this man was a charlatan who was about to con the life savings out of at least 2 known trusting victims.
He would often give psychic consultations to people who wanted to exorcise ghosts or who wanted to contact loved ones who'd passed away. And he had sessions that he conducted. Groups of 20, 30 people get together, have some sort of seance, holding hands, you can imagine the sort of thing. And he would basically act as the conduit, the medium, and quite literally the psychic medium for that group.
Paul Williams was using his professed skills as a psychic to con people. And so, therefore, his victims, in effect, would come to him, or very convenient.
This is an example of self-selecting marks, which is one of the reasons why the psychic sort of scam game is popular and profitable. Because as soon as people come to see you as a psychic, then you already know that they're fairly gullible. And they actually come to see you and say, I believe, so you're off to a good start there. And of course, there's no way to disprove what people say from you on the grave. So yeah, it gives them much more license to get away with stuff.
When people came to Paul Williams, they'd obviously just lost a loved one. They were in an intensely vulnerable state. They were old, you know, and they needed support. They needed somebody to help them. They were reaching out for help. And he totally abused and betrayed their trust.
One of the women who truly believed in Paul Williams' gift as a psychic medium was Irene Hickson. Irene first visited Williams for a psychic reading in 1998, hoping to contact Ernest, her husband who had recently passed away. Williams quickly befriended Irene, as this footage from an unaired TV pilot shows.
With me today is Irene Hickson, and she's now my adopted mother and very, very precious to me.
He quickly ingratiated himself into her life. I think he probably quite quickly found out that she hadn't got any children and that she was very wealthy. She owned a nice house in Tipton, and she also had a lot of jewellery. She also had a lot of Royal Dalton figurines. There were 3 lodgers lodging in her house from which she derived an income. And anyway, Paul befriended her. 4 months later, she made a will, leaving all of her property and estate to Paul Williams. And if Paul should die before she did, it was to go to his son, Stephen. There were a couple of other bequests, some charitable bequests, a couple of £1,000 here, £1,000 there to other relatives. But the bulk of the estate and the house was left to Paul Williams.
Irene Hickson did have 2 living cousins, Doug and John Hyde, she was close to. But the will created at Paul Williams' solicitor on the 12th of February 1999 left Irene's house to her new friend of 4 months. Sadly, by the autumn of that same year, Irene Hickson's health had begun to deteriorate. She was admitted to hospital, and her concerned cousins rushed to see her.
It's a strong indication of the power that Paul actually had over Irene in the end, that in fact when she was ill in hospital, and her 2 cousins, who she was very close with, she'd spent every Christmas with them, visited them regularly. When they tried to visit her in hospital, it was in fact Paul who was referred to by hospital staff as her son.
And Doug said, "What do you mean? She doesn't have a son?" And the sister said, "She does. I've met him, Paul." He knew the existence of this Paul fellow. He knew that Irene was into the spiritual side of things. He just sort of thought he must be involved in this sort of group. And he said to Paul, "You know, what's this? You're passing yourself off as her son? What's going on?" And apparently Paul said, "Oh, I'm the son she never had. She likes to call me her son because I'm the son she never had." And Doug said, at the time, I thought, well, you know, it's fair enough. It's a fair enough explanation. He seemed like a nice guy. He seemed like he was helping Irene. I thought, you know, fair enough. A couple of months later, Irene got very ill, and Doug wrote to her solicitor saying, "Do you think we should have perhaps power of attorney?" offering to make Paul power of attorney with him and his brothers. The solicitor wrote back on Paul's instruction saying, no, she's of entirely sound mind. We don't need to make her power of attorney. In fact, she's getting better. A couple of months after that, sadly, Irene passed away.
Irene Hickson died on the 22nd of December 2000, just over 2 years after meeting Paul Williams. With her death came Doug and John's realization that their cousin had left most of her estate to Paul Williams. But there was a further shocking discovery to be revealed.
And most devastatingly, the executor of the will was Paul. He had complete control after she died. Now, Irene didn't have any children, but she did have cousins, and she did have nieces and nephews. Perhaps one would think that she might have made them, her family, the executor of her will, not someone she'd only met 4 months previously.
Doug and John Hyde could not face seeing Williams dominating the proceedings at Irene's funeral and were so upset they didn't attend. But Williams was there and he was centre stage.
At the funeral, Paul made a eulogy. Doug's wife went. She said that it was the most hideous thing she'd ever heard. He cried crocodile tears. He said that Irene was his closest friend. The second mother he'd had. She said it just rung so hollow.
Now, no doubt Williams convinced himself that actually he wasn't doing anything wrong. If Irene wanted to leave her possessions to him upon her death of her own free will, well, so be it. Who's to deny her her dying wish? Well, actually, he was to deny her her dying wish later on.
Paul Williams hadn't broken the law, but Irene Hickson's generosity gave the bogus psychic the means to go on and con one of her lodgers in the cruelest way, and the con man failed to respect Irene Hickson's final wishes.
We get a glimpse of the true man, Paul Williams, after she dies, because in fact he does gain ownership of her house, but in her will, as he well knew, she stipulated that she wanted her lodgers to carry on living there.
One of them had already died by this point, but there were two others, Gerard Rowley and Ted Bushkowinski, Polish chap. In Irene's will, it stipulated that these men should be able to live there for as long as they wanted after her death. 12 months to 18 months after Irene had died, the house was sold. Ted is thought to be homeless on the streets of Tipton, and Gerard Rowley was put into a nursing home, helped by Paul Williams. It's not exactly what Irene would have wanted.
He totally abused the trust that she'd placed in him, and he very quickly turned his attention to who he could manipulate next, and that was Jerry Rowley, one of Irene's elderly lodgers.
Paul Williams didn't rely on the fact he was a semi-famous psychic to work his magic. He relied on the fact his victim was vulnerable, elderly, and blind with cataracts.
Clearly, Williams saw the opportunity there to take advantage of him and groomed him, built up a relationship with him of trust again. And eventually, Williams managed to steal his life savings from that poor man.
Homeless after Irene Hickson's death, Paul Williams had found Jerry Rowley accommodation 10 miles away from his old home and helped to transfer his money to a more convenient bank. An act of kindness on the surface, it was actually a way for Paul Williams to devastatingly and heartlessly con an elderly disabled man out of thousands of pounds he was saving to fund his funeral.
Well, I was nearly blind that time. I was nearly blind. I couldn't see anything. If I dropped a 50p piece on the floor, I had very bad with cataracts, and I couldn't see anything. So I had my bank building society account in Tipton Building Society. So he said it would be better for me to transfer it from there to the Yorkshire here on High Street. So he went and I gave him the book. He went in and changed it from there up here to the Yorkshire, and it was like it wasn't a joint account, it was in my name. He puts his name on it with mine, and he drew the lot out up here and left me £100 out of 7,000 or whatever it was, about 7,000.
Gerard Rowley, he was a tenant of Irene Hickson's. That's how Paul met him. He helped relocate him after she kicked him out of Irene's house into a sheltered accommodation in Stourbridge. He also persuaded him to swap banks, and in the course of that made sure that he was put as a name on his bank account. He then stole Gerald's checkbook and bank details, and this bank account had about £6,500 in. He'd been saving to pay for his own funeral. Williams drained the lot and wrote many fraudulent cheques.
Cheque fraud, or paper kiting, as it was known in traditional scam circles, it's quite a traditional and lucrative field for scamming, because it's another form of credit. Here's a piece of paper, which is just a piece of paper, but it's worth money. It's ripe for scamming. But yeah, it's another example of how con artists are not troubled by a conscience. Here's this poor old guy, this blind elderly guy, and he's ripping him off. You know, where's the humanity? But con artists don't have any.
Jerry had put money aside for a funeral. No doubt Williams thought, oh well, it's a funeral, he won't really be aware of what's going on at his funeral. Let's face it, he'll be dead, so it won't matter, will it? It won't matter if I just siphon off this money.
In 2003, Paul Williams stole £2,900 from Jerry Rowley's account, as well as fraudulently using the pensioner's chequebook to steal a further £3,591, leaving Jerry's funds decimated. A friend of Jerry's became concerned about the fact Paul Williams had Jerry Rowley's bank book. Jerry had tried to contact Williams for the book several times, but to no avail. So his friend took him to his new bank, where the horror of what Williams had done to the 82-year-old man was finally revealed.
She used to run the Talbot Hotel here, the landlady on the Talbot, and they got to know something about it, and she took me up to the Yorkshire Building Society, and they took it out. It was all down there, all the money drawn out in his name, Paul Williams' name. 1,200 was the first lump he drawed out to pay for his petrol down in Wollaston Garage. 1,200. I didn't know anything about it and all that. That was he drew it out in his name, signed his name to it. It was all my money, like every penny was my money.
This was how he was first caught. Gerald discovered that all this money had gone out of his account. He realised that it must have been Williams and went to the police.
Oh, well, the lowest of the low, couldn't get any lower than what I think about him. Couldn't get any lower, and that's... I couldn't place him low enough.
After losing his life savings, Jerry Rowley said he felt suicidal, but thankfully did not act upon his depression. However, Jerry did go to the police and reported what Paul Williams had done to him. Unbeknownst to Williams, the police began to investigate the con man, who, having cleaned out Jerry, had moved on to his next victim, and this victim would endure his cruelest and most callous con yet. Paul Williams' method of using the spiritualist world as his target for scamming may seem rather novel, but within the dark and twisted annals of con artist history, there is a long line of criminals who have used this cruel and heartless method.
Fake psychics have been doing this for a long time. The tools they use to convince people that they're for real, they use something called cold reading, or sometimes they use something called hot reading. Cold reading is basically where you look at people's posture and more to the point you listen to what they say, and you take the tiny clues that they give you and you combine that with making very general statements or guesses or statements which have a high probability of being right, and you read people's reactions, and from that you sort of build up to be more and more accurate, and all the while they think that, you know, you're genuine, but actually you're just kind of, you're not actually really psychically finding anything out, you're just intuiting it or learning it from them. And hot reading is when you actually go and do some research, so you might know in advance that someone's coming to see you, and so you'd actually like look them up on the internet or even employ a private detective maybe to find stuff out, and then of course you can amaze them with information that you've psychically divined.
And from working briefly with Paul Williams, psychic Sabina Hayward witnessed his hot reading firsthand.
I would describe him as quite a manipulative person, and he was almost like, in a way, sometimes trying to get reassurance from me to prove to the audience around how genuine he was. And for example, we went up to, I think we were at the shopping centre, and I believe underneath some people died in a coal mining accident, and he was saying, do you feel anything about how it is around here? Because he was like, he'd find out something about a place first and then claim that he had psychic knowledge through his psychic ability about it. So he would sort of read up on stuff first and then, you know, make out it was purely because he was psychic that he was picking these things up.
As this clip from an unaired TV show reveals, Paul Williams worked hard to convince the world that his psychic abilities were for real, rather than a tool he used to con people out of their life savings.
I travel all over the country looking at the paranormal and looking at these happenings, but the favourite place is exactly where I live, which is the Black Country.
No one could have predicted the cruel scam he was to pull next, but in the meantime, he was worrying and upsetting some of his trusting clients.
people that he'd read for were coming to me quite upset because his attitude towards them, in the sense that sometimes he would just go, I can't read for you, that's it, I'm not reading for you. So they would actually perhaps think the worst. So they'd come like a little bit scared. And of course, then if I looked at the cards and found everything was all right, and I'm starting to think, well, what kind of game is he playing? Looking back now, perhaps he was rejecting them because they didn't have the financial assets to help him, accumulate his money.
I'm sure he saw people of all walks of life, but he was probably able to specifically pick out those who would be more amenable, really, more pliable, more likely to use him for support and take him into their confidence. And these people happened to be very elderly. Also, he knew that these people were likely to die in the future as well, and so there was a good store of money there, and he could have that store of money if he got friendly with them.
By 2004, Williams had already got friendly. He'd inherited a house from Irene Hickson and then stolen over £6,000 from her disabled lodger. Paul Williams was unaware the police had begun to investigate him, and he had already moved on to his next known victim, a couple of spiritualist believers he had known on and off since the 1990s.
The final victims that we know about with Williams were a couple called Joyce and Charles Sutton. Had actually known Williams for a very long time. In the early 90s, they met him through the spiritualist community, and they'd built up a friendship, acquaintanceship over many years, and had built up a lot of trust, I would imagine, between them. But he hadn't actually stolen anything from them up until then.
Joyce Sutton and her husband often visited these spiritualist sessions, which were held periodically at various establishments in Stourbridge. They became good friends, and Joyce Sutton also requested Paul Williams' help to get rid of her evil spirit in her current address in Dudley.
Joyce and Charles had met Paul Williams, or Duran, as he called himself, when he had exorcised the ghost of Charles Sutton's first wife from their home. Joyce was Charles' second wife and felt that his first wife wasn't very happy about their marriage.
Williams even boasted about what he did for Joyce and her husband.
To cut a long story short, I managed to sort that out, and the lady is now very grateful. I receive Christmas cards from her every year, birthday cards and little presents, and she's happy.
Joyce Sutton may have been happy back then, but she had no idea of the evil stunt the bogus psychic would eventually manipulate her with.
She quite clearly believed in what Paul Williams told her, and clearly had a good understanding of the spiritualist world and spiritualism from the meetings that she attended. And I think, based on the publicity that Paul gave himself, the meetings that she attended and the work that he did at her home address, I think she believed everything that was said to her.
At the end of 2004, Mrs Sutton's husband Charles fell ill. Mrs Sutton relied on Paul Williams to take her to hospital, do little errands for her. Unfortunately, at the end of 2004, Mr Sutton died. Obviously, quite catastrophic for Mrs Sutton.
Charles Sutton had a heart attack, it was a massive stroke, passed away December 2004. Joyce, absolutely devastated, lent on her friend Paul Duran.
Paul Williams swooped in to console the grieving widow, the first stage in his wicked plan.
And he was there for her, surprisingly. He was a rock, and he helped her deal with the death of her husband, and in fact encouraged her to move out into a hotel while she came to terms with what had happened to her husband.
And I think, again, as it progressed, Joyce placed even more trust in Paul Williams. And it was his road in, if you like, to get into the heart of what he was looking to do to Joyce.
The similarities between the Hickson case and the Sutton's case is the relationship between Williams and his potential victims, and the fact that he uses his so-called psychic abilities to perhaps have a hold over them, a power over them, the fact that he has ability to talk to somebody that they love, and because of that they respect him and trust him, and he builds up relationships with them for some time before actually carrying out the fraud. So he's a very clever, very manipulative man.
Despite seeming to be the ultimate supportive and sympathetic friend, Paul Williams was actually plotting to betray and manipulate Joyce Sutton and the psychic world to a whole new level. A betrayal in the most disturbing and sickening way imaginable.
Short time after Mr Sutton's death, Joyce Sutton was told by Paul Williams that he had a message from beyond the grave. Charles had contacted him. Obviously, Mrs Sutton, being quite vulnerable, believed this.
What's intriguing was that Williams actually told Joyce that he'd had a psychic message pushing him, pulling him and leading him towards the grandfather clock, where, surprise, surprise, the will was found hidden.
Hidden inside the clock was a will, a yellowing, aged bit of paper.
The will, supposedly constructed by Charles Sutton, left exactly 50-50 his estate, his money from his county, if you like, equally between Mrs Sutton and Paul Williams.
And Joyce herself said she couldn't quite believe it because he hadn't really liked Paul very much. But they went down to the bank. The bank honoured the document, and Paul Williams walked off with $6,500 of poor Joyce's money. But that's not all he did. He also stole her checkbooks. So when Joyce went on holiday for 6 weeks to try and get over her husband's death, he also used her checkbooks to fraudulently drain money on her account as well.
Having gained Mrs Sutton's trust and having access to her finances, and obviously late husband's, he took her checkbook and paid some of his own bills using her checkbook, thus forging a signature.
When she came back from holiday in February 2005, she phoned up the bank to find out her balance and discovered most of the money had gone. She then contacted police, and that's how they tracked him down.
The cheque fraud was a step too far. Paul Williams' greed was his downfall. Joyce Sutton had accepted Williams' bogus claims concerning the will, but when she realised the con man had basically forged her signature and stolen from her account, his vile supernatural scam came crashing down. And whether a spiritualist or non-believer, there is no doubt that preying upon and targeting the recently bereaved is one of the lowest and cruelest crimes a person can commit.
Paul Williams has used his trust as a friend of Mrs Sutton and then abused her trust in the hope that, in her grief, that she would not make any complaint.
So he's gone in there knowing that she's in a very vulnerable position. She's been very, depressed or, upset over the loss of her partner. And he's used that to sort of benefit himself, and I think it's absolutely dreadful. I think it's horrendous.
Fraud in itself is quite a time-consuming process, from gaining the trust of the person initially to actually progressing down the line where the frauds take place. It's very important for the fraudster to gain the trust of the person that he's looking to get money from or steal from. It certainly worked, as we saw in the case of Joyce Sutton.
Well, I think that Williams went a step too far with this whole bogus message from beyond the grave, will behind the grandfather clock ploy. And to me, that seems to indicate that he was just getting greedy. Well, greedier, and he wasn't prepared to put in the effort that he'd had to put in with the other old people. Basically, he wasn't prepared to spend the time ingratiating himself with Mrs Sutton and waiting for her to die. He wanted what he wanted, but he wanted it instantly.
And I know it sounds kind of ridiculously cheeky that he thought he was going to get away with it, but if he felt that she was under his control enough, then he had no reason to suspect that he wouldn't get away with it. It is possible that he fell victim to his own confidence trick, in the sense that he was too confident in his power over his victim and too confident that he'd get away with it. But confidence artists are not generally the most sort of forward-thinking or careful, or conscientious individuals, so they're often very careless in that sense.
The game was up, and Paul Williams should have known what was going to happen next.
Mrs Sutton contacted the police in early summer 2005 when she realised that funds had gone missing from her bank account without her knowledge. It was only then that she realised that her chequebook from her personal account was missing.
Thankfully, Joyce wasn't taking this lying down. She smelled a rat. Went to the police, who in fact were already investigating Williams because of the money that had been stolen from Gerald Rowley. And they looked at this will and later found it to be a complete forgery.
Paul Williams made thousands from his cons, but he is not the first criminal to target the psychic world to make cash.
If you look at the history of psychic phenomena and spiritualism, it's one long line of debunkings, unmaskings, frauds, con artists, disappointments, you name it, and yet it's still going strong. I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
He clearly was able to stand up and give the impression that he could, in fact, talk to people who had passed away.
In a spiritual sense, you're not reading people's cards and reading their futures to gain. You're actually doing this to help people first and foremost.
It seems helping people was the last thing on Paul Williams' mind. He was using his self-proclaimed gift to do one thing: make money.
These people are old, they're vulnerable, their loved ones have passed away, and he knows exactly which buttons to press.
If you look at his scam, it's kind of more of a sweetheart scam almost, because he was convincing people to, if not fall in love with him, certainly to sort of become closely involved with him and trust him.
By 2005, Paul Williams' scams and lies had caught up with him when grieving Joyce Sutton realised he had stolen her chequebook and used it to pay his own bills. And she went to the police, who took the psychic scammer's manipulation of the most vulnerable section of society very seriously.
Paul Williams was arrested by my colleague for the deception, or the theft of the chequebook, and the subsequent fraudulent transactions on the cheques. A search was carried out at his home address, where various documents belonging to Joyce and Charles Sutton were found, as well as other different documents that he really didn't really need, that belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Sutton. While this was going on, Mrs. Sutton contacted myself to make me aware of the will, as she got quite a few concerns, and in the light of what had happened with the cheque frauds, she was concerned that the will might be a forgery. Our investigation proved that the will was in fact a forgery made by Williams.
And at Wolverhampton Crown Court, Paul Williams, seen here arriving for his hearing, had to decide if he was finally going to admit his charade and scam.
I think it took everyone really a little bit by surprise, and he's in fact pleaded guilty. Most people who had their eye on the case, like the Sunday Mercury had, expected him to plead not guilty. These were elderly people in cross-examination. Barristers could probably say that they were confused, he was only trying to help them, etc, etc. And the charges that he's admitted in court relate to the forgery of the Sutton's will, the money he stole from Joyce, and the money he stole from Joe Rowley. The police say there are other things that he's done and other people who they believe he's conned, but it's very difficult to prove.
But the evidence the police had from 82-year-old Jerry Rowley and recently bereaved Joyce Sutton was irrefutable. Williams had no choice but own up to his crimes and plead guilty. After the hearing, local reporter Emily Andrews paid the con artist a visit before he was sentenced for his crimes.
So I said, Paul Williams? He said, yes. And I said, is it Duran? And he went, he wants to know. And I said, Emily Andrews, Sunday Mercury, we're running a story about you this week. And he just sort of looked very shocked and turned quite pale. And I said, well, look, you've preyed on these elderly people. You've admitted it now in court. What's your excuse? And there was just this sort of litany of rubbish, really. He said, oh, I'm really ill. I've got mental health problems. I've had a really bad back. My barrister will say will give my sort of mitigation at the sentencing. I said, well, come on, Paul. This is your opportunity to tell me. We're printing this story this Sunday. Your face is going to go on the front page. Everyone in the Midlands is going to know what a con man you are and how despicably you've behaved. What's your excuse? He didn't really have one, apart from the fact that these people weren't really telling the truth. And I said, but you pleaded guilty, you've admitted it. He said, oh, there's two sides to every story, And I said, well, come on then, give me your side. What's your side? He said, oh, I can't talk to you. My barrister says I can't talk. I said, well, that's convenient, isn't it? And he said, oh, well, I'll talk to you after the trial. I said, what, when you're in jail? He said, yeah, maybe we can write a book together. I just thought, no, maybe we can't, actually. Thanks very much.
As well as Williams weakly claiming health problems had prompted his cruel and callous criminal behaviour, the psychic scammer, in reference to his self-proclaimed gift, also stated, I've given it all up after this affair blew up. At the sentencing, Adam Weston, who defended Williams, claimed that the con man used the money he gained to fund an extramarital affair and to fund his lifestyle rather than accept his loss in status after losing his job.
So basically what he was saying was he needed money and he was prepared to go to whatever lengths to obtain that money, even if it meant defrauding elderly bereaved people. So that's not much of a defence really, in my view. Saying, hey, I've got a lifestyle to support. Well, don't we all? Yes, we do, but we don't actually betray other people's confidences in order to support our own way of living.
Paul Williams received an 18-month custodial sentence for the deceptions. The recorder at the time of the hearing stated that even he should have seen this coming.
The court reporter added, "You don't have to be clairvoyant when you've done what you did to see that." Whether Paul Williams' alleged psychic ability allowed him to see an 18-month jail sentence in his future remains a mystery, along with whether there are more elderly victims out there who fell foul of Paul Williams' cold, calculating and cruel con. But Williams is such a successful con man that there are people out there who believe in his purported gift, even one of his victims.
Some people still believe he is psychic and his psychic abilities. Even I think Joyce Sutton, who he robbed in the most callous of ways, she still believes he does have psychic abilities. I think she still believes that he did in fact get rid of the ghost of Charles's first wife. But I think she feels absolutely furious that he took her for the ride that he did, and that he conned these old people in the most callous of ways. He pressed the buttons and walked away with their money.
Joyce Sutton, she has trusted this man and now knows that he has betrayed her trust and, for all intents and purposes, become a virtual recluse.
None of Paul Williams' elderly and vulnerable victims ever got their money back after being conned by the bogus psychic, who is now out of prison after serving just 4 months of his 18-month sentence.
It's heartrending to think that these people have opened their souls to him and he's taken advantage of them, and it makes it very difficult to build up trust with anyone in the future after something like that's happened to you.
In this area of sort of psychic phenomena, people are self-selecting themselves. People who believe in it are automatically going to be a bit more gullible about that kind of thing. But you would hope that anyone who did read the report about Paul Williams would think twice.
He used those lies for profit. He used those lies to buy his wife a top-of-the-range Porsche. He used those lies to live in a luxury house by the canal side. And he used those lies to prey on vulnerable old people who believed every word he said.